Dyna ni, wel, prynhawn da iawn. Very good afternoon to you and a very warm welcome to the National Library and to the Drum for this event entitled Reading the World, Thomas Pennant and the Practices of Natural History. It's a great pleasure to be presenting this event. Its origins, or the basis for what you'll hear today, comes or is derived from the Curious Travellers 2 project funded by the HRC and the partnership between a number of partners, University of Glasgow, the University Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies, ourselves as a National Library, and the Natural History Museum. And it's great to be able to welcome, a special welcome to Dr Edwin Rose, who will be talking to us this afternoon. We're trying to keep up with where you're at, Edwin, and the notes I was given. So since May, Edwin has taken up a new post as a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Researcher Fellow in the Centre for History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Leeds. He's also a Fellow at Darwin College, Cambridge, and still an affiliated lecturer at the university's Faculty of History as well. So that's a little bit about Edwin. He's of course the author of the book, which you might have seen on the way in, that was published here in the UK on the 13th of May. And I understand there's been a big demand for that book. So do have a look on the way out and take advantage. So with those many words, I think I'll hand over to Edwin and let you enjoy the rest of the event. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you ever so much for such a generous introduction, and it's a delight to be presenting here at the National Library of Wales, where I have spent many hours in the reading rooms, making the staff carry lots of fairly large volumes to and fro from the special collections stores. It's a true delight, and the material that I've come across here is absolutely extraordinary, and some of it you will be seeing in this talk later in the next 50 minutes or so. So on the 13th of July 1771, the day after disembarking from James Cook's ship Endeavour, that had for the previous 3 years undertaken one of the most significant voyages of discovery to the South Pacific, during which Cook had charted the eastern coast of Australia for the first time, the young naturalist Joseph Banks wrote to the Flintshire-based naturalist, 20 years his senior, Thomas Pennant, to quote, "In a few days I shall be able to write more understandably. Now I am mad. My poor brain whirls with innumerable things, which return to my native country, have excited as soon as I enjoy lucid interval, I shall write again." The question remains, however, as to why Pennant was Banks's first port of call after this voyage, and where Banks and the Swedish naturalist and former student of Linnaeus, Daniel Solander, had collected specimens represented over 1,000 species previously unknown to European natural history. The answer really is simple. Pennant was widely regarded as the most important British zoologist of this generation, and by historians, myself included, of the late 18th century as a whole. And many, really since the 1950s, have actually outlined how Pennant is the most important British zoologist between John Ray in the 17th century. John Ray formed the basis for most of the systems of classification we even use today. It's fundamental for Linnaeus, and Charles Darwin in the 19th century. So as such, in this current talk, I'm going to discuss some of the content of my new book that you might well have seen. That's what it looks like. Reading the World, British Practices of Natural History, 1760 to 1820, and some copies are available for purchase outside. And a considerable part of this research was based on the collections now held by the National Library of Wales. So initially I explore Pennant's collaborative natural history practices and the routes he took to secure the publication of large portions of the collection he assembled at Downing Hall, his country estate in North Wales. That's the book cover. Before ending with a discussion of how he made the books and actually produced the books and then circulated them across contemporary society. So, using Pennant as the main example, I hope to show how information was collected in the field, inserted into a collection, and integrated into a never-ending process of continually publishing updated versions of printed works to build Thomas and his son David Pennant's genteel reputations. As such, I hope this talk and this book challenges notions that these collections form centres of knowledge. Rather, I suggest that natural history collections of the period, Pennant's included, formed important points where information was interpreted, revised and redistributed. In the preface to his monumental British Zoology, Thomas Pennant explained his motivations for producing a work of natural history and assembling a collection. He noted that, to quote, "This is a general view of the natural history of our own country. Why then should we neglect inquiring into the various benefits that result from these instances of the wisdom of our Creator, which his divine munificence has so liberally and immediately placed before us?" Close quote. This shows that following in the footsteps of the 17th century clerics, notably John Ray and William Derham, that Pennant intended to undertake a detailed systematic study of the natural world. His objective was to explore divine wisdom in God's creation, a project that necessitated the development of advanced tools for managing information and extending knowledge of God's design to the reading public of Britain. So, from the 1750s, Pennant started to assemble this vast natural history collection at Downing Hall, and for his account of this, you're very welcome to have a look at this particular volume, which is Pennant's own account of his local area, which is an original. So please, you're welcome to hand it around, but be careful. So Thomas Pennant, began to assemble this vast natural history museum, and the house itself essentially became a museum and library. When Pennant's collection was being sold in the early 20th century, one reporter noted that, to quote, "It is a very numerous collection, and many of the specimens are of such rarity and value, including precious stones. It is contained in handsome cabinets, etc., well classified and arranged and labelled. The birds are in glass cases, which since the death of Thomas Pennant in 1798 have ornamented the tops of the bookcases in the library and the print room." Close quote. And here is a floor plan of Downing Hall, and the C was the library, and the print room was D. A was where he kept the portraits, and B was a really interesting room where he collected a group of paintings showing the four known corners of the earth. These very large paintings have disappeared, so if you see any large 6-foot-long pictures of penguins, let me know. And here is just a few of the collections now held by the Natural History Museum in London. So these are some shells. There's a very sorry-looking rabbit and a stoat from his mammalian collections. Fossils, the original cabinets for the fossils still survive. Birds, which formed a major part in both his British zoology and his Indian zoology. Birds from around the world. And there are a couple of photos of the house before the collections were sold off in the early 20th century. The house is now a ruin. There's nothing left, really. So this, you can see, is the hallway. Up here, you can see the penguins. So you can see the colossal size of more of these amazing pictures of natural history. And this is the library as it was at the turn of the 20th century. So the initial stages in Pennant's practice of natural history are represented in his approaches to gathering information. These took several forms, ranging from his own collecting in his local vicinity around Downing, his tours across Britain, to visits to collections of art and naturalia, and his extensive global correspondence network. Initially, Pennant's collecting is represented by the practices he employed to record, describe, catalogue and obtain species, forming taxonomic inventories of species Pennant observed in his local county and parish. Early examples of the books that he was using was his copy of John Ray and Francis Willoughby's Ornithology. This is now held in the National Library, a book that he noted to have inspired, to quote, "a great love for natural history in general," close quote, noting on the first end paper that the species he marked with a small star were found in Flintshire. Pennant employed these practices in several other taxonomic works, ranging from the late 17th century to the most up-to-date works or books at the very time that he was writing, creating a system that facilitated the recirculation and collaborative accumulation of geographically specific information that allowed Pennant to contribute to the emergent field of biogeography, understanding the distribution of species across different climatic zones, while weaving localised accounts together to create a broader national picture. And this really went towards devising a set of geographic boundaries for species distribution across Britain. Pennant laid this out in his Arctic Zoology, probably one of the most research-intensive and complex books that he actually produced, in which he attempted to give an account of all animal species. Oh, this is just the example of the, so you can see the bittern here that he's marked. This is the actual bittern specimen from his collection now in the Natural History Museum. But Pennant, in the Arctic Zoology, actually outlined lines across the surface of the Earth. And you can really see how these very detailed accounts that he's compiling and using these books as these kind of working tools, in addition to correspondence coming in, that he's actually one of the few people who's actually qualified enough to make these kinds of assumptions in this period. This is actually really important because it's a means for dividing up the land based on economics and productivity, which was of great importance in the 18th century. So Pennant intended for his Arctic Zoology to form a new zoological account of North America. However, owing to the American Revolution and war between 1776 and 1782 and the independence of the 13 colonies to form the United States, Pennant turned his attention to a zoology of the polar regions, noting in the preface, to quote, "When the fatal and humiliating hour arrived, which deprived Britain of power, strength and glory, I felt mortification which must strike every feeling individual at losing his little share in the boast of ruling over half of the new world." Close quote. Now I'm going to get back to Britain. So, writing to his brother John in 1775, the Selborne-based naturalist Gilbert White noted, "Mr. P was last summer at the Isle of Man and intends to give an account of that place also. He has now taken great pains to investigate Great Britain and its islands and will be well qualified to put the last hand to the British Zoology in quarto edition." In this description, White outlines Pennant's working practices and necessity of travel and correspondence for constructing national and global accounts of natural history. In addition to knitting together inventories collected over specific areas, Pennant travelled through these regions, although he acknowledged that travelling at speed and not staying in any one place for longer than just a few days was inadequate for creating a comprehensive natural historical account. However, it did secure Pennant's ambition to build a network of observers, these were very loyal observers, who felt a genteel obligation to send accounts of their findings. Pennant rarely travelled alone. While the linguistic expertise of his travelling companion, he relied on the linguistic expertise of his travelling companions, numerous parochial clergy and officials, and this ensured these individuals acted as what's been called in the literature as go-betweens with local people to facilitate the transfer of vast quantities of information. So when travelling across Scotland, for example, in 1769, Pennant took an interleaved copy of the English and Welsh vocabularies of animal names that he had published as the appendices in the 1768 edition of the British Zoology, and used information supplied by John Gray of Helmsdale, near the Ord of Caithness, to produce what's essentially a trilingual account. Thank you, Mary Ann, for bringing that word up in one of our many conversations. And these are most of the species named here are actually things that were in direct use within the local economy. An important example of this is this extraordinary picture from Pennant's extra-illustrated tour of Scotland and voyage to the Hebrides, now held by the National Library. And the Curious Travellers project is currently in the process of creating essentially a digital edition of these, but also going through and tagging all of these numerous extra illustrations that appear in Pennant's copy. These sorts of level of images do not appear in the regular published accounts you'll find on Google Books. These volumes are totally unique. And the basking shark is one of the most important of these illustrations that Moses Griffith reproduced for this particular work. The basking shark was important economically because of its use in the extraction of oil that was then later used in lamps. And you can see here a ship, usually supposed to be Pennant's ship, which he chartered for this voyage, the Lady Frederick Campbell, and you can see obviously the smaller boat going out to harpoon the basking shark. And you can't see it here, but you can see it in the previous slide. It's mounted next to the corresponding plate in Pennant's British Zoology. So these books were designed to be kind of read together in addition to the images. So Pennant's linguistic interests were undoubtedly founded by William Morris of Anglesey, an expert Welsh linguist and founding member of the Cymroedian Society. Morris's handwriting appears throughout the early lists of species that Pennant tipped into the back of his copy of Ray and Willoughby's Ornithology, and added that Pennant had entitled the British names and a translation of the British. And if one takes the example of the, for example, get one up, the reed sparrow, you can see it there, number 3. You can then see in Morris's hand the Welsh name, and then you can actually see the direct translation of this particular bird. I think he's got blackhead of the reeds there. So you really see the detail they're going into in actually translating this information. These practices of recording species names are crucial for eliminating synonymy in taxonomic lists, that being multiple names for the same species, while tying down the linguistic root of species nomenclature, facilitating the development of names designed to translate between cultures while taking an inventory that connected species to their geographical provenance. In addition to Morris, Pennant relied on numerous expert translators on his tours around Britain. For example, John Stuart of Luss was Pennant's travelling companion on his second tour of Scotland. Stuart was famed as a co-translator of the Scottish Gaelic Bible, in addition to being an important Linnaean botanist. In addition to translators, Pennant was obviously accompanied by a whole sort of entourage of other people, including his artist Moses Griffith, and servants who included the French valet Louis Gold. Pennant also examined species held in art collections and menageries and incorporated these into his collections. One example, which is one of my favourites, this is a colour plate in the book, is this extraordinary image of the cheetah by George Stubbs. Then he took his artist, Peter Poho, with Stubbs to Pigot's house out in Staffordshire to essentially extract the image of the cheetah that he then reprinted and published in his book, The Synopsis of Quadrupeds. Pennant also viewed the collections of Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander that they compiled on James Cook's voyage to the Pacific. In 1771, he, to quote, took a journey to London to see Sir Joseph Banks and Dr Solander on their arrival from their circumnavigation, close quote. Pennant emulated many of Solander's practices for managing information in his own collection and while on this trip. For example, the National Library of Wales holds a whole series of slips that Pennant used to copy species names and descriptions from those developed by Solander, whose approaches to managing information they're detailed in my book, and I'm not going to go into too much more detail about them here. There's quite a lot of pages on that. Pennant's slips really describe and order numerous species observed across the Pacific and especially New South Wales, and show how he organised these diverse bodies of information. Pennant was also a key player in the various voyages of discovery. In one letter forwarded to Pennant by Daines Barrington, the Earl of Sandwich, the first Sea Lord of the Admiralty, complained about Johann Reinhold Forster, a naturalist who had travelled on Cook's second voyage, describing him as, to quote, "Soon after I became acquainted with Dr. Forster, I found he was a person that could not keep a friend for any length of time. His behaviour to me, who did my utmost to serve him, was plain proof of that affliction." Close quote. And a result of these continual arguments that brought in all sorts of things, very early interesting debate about intellectual property as well. Forster essentially left Britain with his tail between his legs to go to Germany. He was originally from Germany. And this is represented in this satirical cartoon from the Pennant collections here at the National Library. You can see Forster riding backwards on a donkey, not looking terribly fine at all. And that's his young son, Georg, who produced many of the natural history illustrations, and then with his wife and other children in tow. There's a huge amount to be read into this cartoon. Not only the fact it's all completely false. Wales is actually a reference to Wales, who Forster was famed, who had the plagiarism dispute with. Dr. Faustus didn't exist. He's actually a German legend famed for stealing the invention of the printing press in the 15th century. So it's all a complete spoof, what we're seeing here. Pennant's collection at Downing, then, became an important site for gathering, interpreting and adapting and recommunicating information on the natural world. Dozens of extensive accounts communicated across a global network ended up being published in Pennant's works or communicated in journals. The collection at Downing was then classified according to a range of different approaches, most notably according to the earlier system of John Ray and the contemporary system devised and developed by Linnaeus. To understand the differences between these two systems, again, consult my book, but I will go into a few of the details now. So Pennant's collection was arranged to facilitate the collaborative production of printed books on natural history, and books were kept in very close proximity to the physical specimens. Many of the manuscripts from Pennant's collection at Downing are in a variety of different hands and contain specimens they discuss. Typical examples include this really quite extraordinary manuscript that Pennant compiled on the plants of the Atlantic Islands and West Africa, for which he sourced information and objects directly from those involved in the transatlantic slave trade. And in addition, you can see here that this is not all of Pennant's handwriting. So, for example, this bit here is Pennant. Above it is actually the handwriting of Hugh Davis of Beaumaris, who was a very eminent Welsh botanist, the author of Welsh Botanology, which came out in the early 19th century. So you can really see the closeness of how these people are working with their hands appearing on the very same page. There are consistent connections between Pennant's collections and his publications, although what we have now is usually in a bit of a sorry state, because many of them were taken out of the original mounts in the glass boxes, then their necks were snapped and bent and their legs bent backwards so they would fit in the newly built museum drawers in the Natural History Museum at the turn of the 20th century. But many of the specimens do actually link up with the images produced in Pennant's book. So this is a jerboa from his History of the Quadrupeds. Perhaps the most important publication of Pennant's career, however, was British Zoology. This work met multiple editions extending from a grand imperial folio published in 1766 through to smaller octavo volumes, the last London edition being published in 1812. There were a few other editions after. The bibliography of this book is incredibly complicated. Pennant maintained a firm grip over the production process, privately employing artists, engravers, printers and a publisher, who, for this particular project, was mostly Benjamin White of Fleet Street, the brother of his correspondent Gilbert White of Selborne. Although Pennant was responsible for constructing the text, he did not possess the skills of trained artists. As such, Pennant believed that the artists who depicted species in his published works required just as much familiarity as he did. For example, this ledger held by the National Library in Pennant's hand actually shows, and you can see at the bottom here, the reference to the artist Peter Peho visiting Pennant at his home then at Bicton Hall, July 23rd to September 27th, 1762, for the specific reason of illustrating the specimens from his collection. So there for considerable amounts of time and really got, familiarity with these particular collections. The entire process of producing this book, I go through a lot of the financials in my book, and the really interesting thing, this is just a couple of the images from, this is the original from now in the British Museum, and this is the 1766 British Zoology, but a lot of the books Pennant produced, they're really interesting because they represent the full breadth of marketable natural history books in this period. Essentially, the ability to sort of market and publish books was very much kind of in its infancy, especially publishing on the scale that Pennant did. Perhaps the most pertinent example, which shows the relationships between specimens in Pennant's collection and his books, relate to the 1776 edition of British Zoology, a book Pennant divided in terms of its classification and volumes between the systems developed by John Ray in the 17th century, in the first two volumes, and that surveyed quadrupeds and birds, and the new Linnaean system of classification in the second two volumes that outlined reptiles, fish, mollusca and crustacea. Pennant's so-called discovery of Moses Griffith around 1770 gave him the unique opportunity for the first part of his career, Griffith's career at least, to monopolise Griffith's artistic skill. And he did this for decades, really. Pennant was always his primary patron. There's more illustrations by Griffiths in Pennant's collection than anywhere else. And he was constantly supervising Griffith's illustrations of his collection. In addition, so you can actually see here the accounts which discuss Griffith. These are drawings. Many of them, he actually says the money goes directly to Moses. But it is a very collaborative. I mean, the thing that I've just highlighted here actually is a really interesting reference to Pennant's sisters. They got £52. And this is in the account book for the actual making of the book. So I suspect some of the unsigned plates might well be by them as well. But we really, Curious Travellers team, this is something for the future, I think, is to really look into these kind of unknown sort of people who've disappeared really into the historical record. The artist's familiarity with the collection, however, this is one of the examples, really comes through very, very clearly when you look at these comparative illustrations. This is one of the colour plates in my book, Reading the World. But you can really see that even these very fine lines of discoloration been copied with absolute detail. The really interesting thing about this, however, is it is produced according to the Linnaean system, which relied specifically on the physical morphology of the thing itself. So you can actually, a lot of the classification depended on the hinge there, so there's been particular attention paid to the hinge of the specimen. And these are some more of the shells. The original illustrations, mostly by Griffith, are now held in a private collection in the USA. But you can really see the very, very clear similarities between these. Here we go again. I must thank a colleague, Stephanie Holt, for acquiring some of these fantastic photos from the Natural History Museum in London. Pennant's birds, however, were arranged according to a very different set of principles in terms of their classification. Rather than relying on the more recent Linnaean system, Pennant used that developed by John Ray in the late 17th century. This reflects Pennant's interest in birds as a more animated branch of natural history. Although Ray's system does have its basic root in the physical features of the animals themselves, working from sharp hooked beaks and talons and going down in almost a diagonal pattern to birds which are waders, particularly with webbed feet and bills, you really see... Oh, that's just another shell. You really see that these birds, however, are situated in an idealised version of their natural environment. So there was always, if it's a water bird, they're always depicted near a pond or something of that nature. If they're a woodland bird, they're nearly always depicted on a bit of stick, essentially, to show where they lived. And this is a far more holistic view to classification. Ray also paid great attention to things like the sounds the birds made. Whereas in comparison for shells, well, how can you listen to a whelk, for example? It doesn't really make sense. So you can really see Pennant's reasoning for this quite sharp division. And if you look at a copy of British Zoology of this edition, you really see differences in the whole construction of the book as you're going through. The whole nature of the descriptions is completely different. Very brief and morphological for the Linnaean sections. The earlier sections are very prosaic. He's a very, very nice writer, and he writes tracts about what they sound like, and then he said, oh, Mr. So-and-so heard them at this time or saw them migrating at this time, and all of these aspects come into the whole system. The distribution of Pennant's books is really, really important. Others who played, I should just tell you, some others who played an important role. So you've got Moses Griffith here. Then he actually employed the engraver William Hickson in London to produce the plate. So this is an incredibly collaborative process that you're seeing across here. I still haven't worked out who his taxidermist was. That's something I'm sure it's mentioned somewhere in some letter. But yeah, the amount of people involved in this whole process is really, really important to understand. So once all of the components were printed, the next stage is to distribute books. The 1766 edition of British Zoology was primarily funded through subscription, that being people who gave money to support the project before it actually existed. And this meant that it is actually possible to map out the precise global distribution of this book. And I have all of these maps published as plates in my book. Some copies were also sent to booksellers in the intent to offset the initial costs of the publication. However, this book was incredibly expensive, basically bankrupted Morris, and Pennant kind of left the project with his tail between his legs. He was almost going to give up on natural history in the late 1760s. However, it was Benjamin White, actually, who proposed to him to produce an octavo edition of British Zoology, and he recycles a lot of the text and has smaller plates engraved, and this did rather well, and it resulted in it becoming a multiple edition project. And probably the most significant is the 1776 to 77 edition. And the really interesting thing about this is he never set out to make money. In an age, in the literature, this is judged to be an age when commerce really came into bookselling. Pennant always made sure that he broke even, and he gave lots of copies away. So held at the Linnaean Society is one of the lists of correspondents who had helped him produce this book. And these are people who received a complimentary copy. I wish I'd have had 21 complimentary copies of my book. Anyway, the National Library does have one. But he was very explicit, actually, about this particular project in this extraordinary quote, James Edward Smith. "I never yet sold a copy of any work for more than my expenses. My prerequisite was the retaining of 20 copies of every edition to give away." And then at present, he explains, he's actually run out. So this is Pennant's view of Hindustan that was mentioned at the end of that particular book. The copy held by the National Library of Wales is actually Pennant's own copy of the printed text that he seems to have been annotating until just sort of days or maybe weeks before he died in 1798. However, publication of these books was never seen as an endpoint in this collecting, this constant collecting and accumulating of information. It's really an ongoing process, and even after the books are published, they acted as a stimulus to encourage more people to write to Thomas Pennant. So Downing Hall started to just become completely full of bits of paper, new books being sent, specimens being sent, observations, and Pennant's work really then goes into every new edition. And if you look at the editions of any of his books, they start off quite thin in the 1760s before they double in length by the time of the next edition. Hundreds of pages added, dozens more plates. And you see this process going on and on. So the manuscript slips, which I showed you before, those index cards on New South Wales, they're integrated with other slips that different people sent him in different handwriting. So Daniel Solander, the Lannau'r apostle, sent him numerous slips, one of which describes a toad that he found on Putney Common, the natterjack toad. So this project continued, though. It was a multi-generational project. Pennant's son David actually took over a lot of the work after Thomas Pennant died, and he was constantly revising and adding to these Pennant's own copies of the British Zoology. They're not just full of notes, though. This was something which I was really quite struck by when looking through these books now in the Natural History Museum in London. They also contain objects, the actual specimens that were being sent through the post to Downing Hall. And you see this in this particular extraordinary example of the snow bunting. And this is really important. This was sent to David Pennant by Hugh Davis of Anglesey, who I'll talk about again in a minute. But what David Pennant was able to deduce here is that in the original version, the snow bunting and the tawny bunting were described as two different species. Davis sending a specimen of this nature showing the transition from brown to white for the winter actually allowed him to work out that it is actually the same bird, meaning that he was able to eliminate one of these species descriptions. So you literally see him crossing out and erasing these descriptions. So you see this going on, but mostly it's just the addition of new stuff, new descriptions, new species as we're going through. Not all of the annotations in these books, however, are in the handwriting of Thomas Pennant and his son David. Evidence for the other hands and the conditions of the volume, they've literally been broken apart in this process, is apparent from the first end paper on which David Pennant has written. Part 1 quadrupeds, pages 1 to 151, sent by Mr. White to W. Hamilton, that's the printer, on January 19th, 1811. Rest of Volume 1 to the Reverend H. Davis as per mail, same day returned and forwarded soon after to Mr. White and then sent to Dr. Latham. Volume 2 sent to H. Davis as per mail, February 7th, returned 5th of March, sent to Dr. Latham and then mailed to White March the 7th. It's a bit technical, a bit listy, but it's actually really important to understand this is a very early example, essentially, of a peer review of these books. It's not blind, but what we're seeing here is him actually getting his colleagues to read through, making sure that the information was as accurate as they knew it for the time before the book was actually published. The handwriting of Davis and the noted ornithologist John Latham can be seen throughout these volumes, editing species descriptions and adding references to the relevant books, usually their own. The other people whose hand appear to be copy editing these volumes is William Hamilton, the Weybridge-based printer that David Pennant actually hired to produce the 1812 edition. Pennant and White did this. Hamilton has made a very basic copy edits, missing commas and that sort of thing. Known annotators of these volumes include, in addition, Thomas Pennant, David Pennant, Pennant's secretary, Thomas Jones, the son of the parish clerk, Latham, Davis, and then the hands of numerous correspondents can be found in here as well, because he was cutting bits out of their letters and gluing them in onto the relevant pages, and then literally putting arrows saying insert, so the typesetter could insert the information. There's also examples of fly sheets. These are really, really rare, representing travelling, very ephemeral information, representing things like travelling shows. So this actually is a narwhal the monodon rhinoceros, that they found on the Lincolnshire coast and then displayed in the back of a pub in Stamford. And they stopped displaying it when it started to smell rather bad. But apparently it was shown to all the gentlemen at Cambridge, Sir Joseph Banks. So this is Joseph Banks's patch as Sheriff of Lincolnshire. And I think it eventually made its way, yes, to the King at Windsor. And then I think they threw it away. David Pennant continued these working practices until well into the 19th century with his annotated copy of the later edition, the 1812 edition of British Zoology, that he was preparing for a new edition in the 1830s. Again, this actually never happened, this edition. Again, it contains numerous notes, textual updates, substantial additions and correspondence, notably from the Reverend Henry Parry of Llanassa, who was essentially one of the neighbours. However, a conspicuous absence from these volumes is the images. To maintain a flexible system for reorganising information, David Pennant kept the illustrations used in these publications in a series of separate blank volumes. And they were never affixed, they weren't essentially albums. They were more fitted in loosely so he could then reorganise them whenever he's updating it according to whatever new system of classification would then emerge. And you can even see his father did lose some down, and then David and his father actually have had to lift these images up and then reorganise them again, particularly towards the 1790s with the new zoological systems of people like Cuvier coming in. And this is just a picture, one of the pictures of these albums now held in the Linda Hall Library in the US. There we go. I did actually find an original drawing this morning from British Zoology, but unfortunately I didn't quite have time to put it into these particular slides. So in this talk, I hope to have teased out some of the main storylines in my new book, Reading the World, that shows how Pennant's natural history programme was intimately connected to his publishing programme, developing a flexible system for managing information. These processes show how Pennant and his collaborative team literally read the world. These following what I've described as a cyclical process from the collection of information in the field that includes vocabularies of the Welsh and Gaelic languages, through to the publication, description and use of books. Annotated copies of Pennant's books, including those kept by Pennant himself and his son David Pennant, in addition to those used by recipients and the readers of Pennant's works, really form important nodes within this system. The information went out, it came back in, it went out. It was always a much more collaborative process. It didn't just suck information in. And these books really formed the vital structure for people to actually start to communicate information at this time. It's much easier if you just reference the description than having to write everything out again. The bulk of Pennant's collections were sold in 1913 and 1938, and many have now been distributed around the world. I have been to America, Australia and continental Europe looking for these materials. Several are also in the Natural History Museum, and the vast bulk of the library is now here in the National Library of Wales. However, I must extend my thanks to the National Library of Wales for late 2023. I was in Auckland Airport at about 4 in the afternoon, and I had an email alert for the word Pennant, which came up on A Books of all places. And I looked at the entry and I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then I thought, oh, I recognise all of that handwriting. This turns out to be the Downing Hall copy of Pennant's book, The Arctic Zoology, which came up in, I think it was an art, sort of art and book place in the US. And amazingly, the National Library was able to acquire this fairly promptly. It is a really, really significant volume containing David Pennant's annotations here. You can see the binding actually matches many of Pennant's library bindings from Downing Hall. It's really, really quite plush parchment with gold tooling. And in it there's also images and notes that relate to their global collections. This is actually by a man called Sigmund Backstrom, who communicated a huge amount of information with the indigenous peoples of Nootka Sound in the Pacific Northwest. And this blog post on the Curious Travellers website, and I do advise you to go and have a look at some of the posts on here, in addition to the huge amount of online correspondence. And I detail some of these extraordinary connections that this volume encapsulates. I mean, you know, he was getting information from Camp Capture and the Bering Sea. It's really quite something. Something this. So, yeah, I mean, it's next year, I should add, is Pennant's tercentenary. 300 years since Thomas Pennant was born. And the library and many other institutions hold a real wealth of extraordinary objects, which don't just tell the story of this single individual, but they actually tell the story of a huge amount more of different people and notions of things like collaboration in knowledge production in the middle to late 18th century. So I really do hope there's some potential perhaps to do something in relation to this tercentenary. So thank you very much for attending this particular lecture. There's some copies of Reading the World outside. I should add that I make absolutely nothing out of this book. So the library is managing all of this. So if you're interested, please do buy them, and I'm very happy to sign a copy as well. So I think we're going to take some questions. Thank you very much.